Hi, I'm Barb Switzer. Thank you for coming and taking Beadily Dee Beads. I think you're really going to enjoy this technique. I do recommend that you have previous experience with wire. Beginners might find it a little frustrating. I'm also going to tell you that nobody's first bead is beautiful. Even if you're an intermediate or advanced level beader, you're probably going to have to make 1 or 2 or even 3 before you're going to like the way your beads look. Let's get started. The tools and materials for today's project are very simple. You want a metric ruler, a 1mm mandrel, a pair of cutters. I'm just very fond of the Tronix angulated cutters because they allow me to get in much tighter when I want to get in and trim my end wires. But any cutter will do for that. If you do end up deciding you want a pair of these fantastic cutters, something to keep in mind is this is not your go-to cutter. You can see that the head on it is very small, great for precision work, and really only appropriate for gauges 22 and smaller. You don't want to be cutting 18 or even 20 gauge wire with this cutter, or it's going to dull the head overly quick. Chain nose pliers, which are helpful but not necessary, and some 26 gauge wire. The number of beads used to build this bead is 8 of your smaller 4mm rounds and 4 of the larger 4x7 rondelles, and then 8 of the daisy spacers. I prefer to work with round beads on this project because I think it makes a nicer finished project. The other thing is that bicones don't work all that well. They frequently break from having the wire pull on them, and they don't sit in position as nicely once you start to put the bead together. These are a few of the beads that I've made using this technique, using the round and rondelle beads that I spoke of earlier. You will also make note of the fact that I've used both clean silver and antiqued wire for these projects, and there's a slight difference in building the bead if you use antiqued wire, which I'll show you in the video. Now I want to show you some of the many samples of jewelry that I've made with the finished beads. Here you see some Beadily Dee beads used in some finished jewelry. Here I've strung on flexible wire beads with a little bit of metal in here and some other matching beads in between, just to create a really nice, pretty, simple bracelet. And in this case, I've run a head pin, a 20 gauge head pin, up through the center just to make a very, very simple pendant necklace on a chain. The style of stringing that you see here with the head pin up through the center will make you a great earring design. All you have to do is stick an ear wire on the top, or maybe some chain and an ear wire for a really cool and fancy and lightweight earring. To start, you're going to need to figure out how long to make your coil. It's a very simple formula. I'm just using a piece of scrap wire here and putting a little bend in the end. It's just so that the beads don't slide off the wire. And then I'm going to string onto this wire whatever sequence of beads I want to run across my beaded bead. So I'm putting on a 4mm, a daisy spacer, a rondelle, another daisy spacer, and a 4mm bead to make a nice little stack. And then I'm going to measure the length of this stack of beads. It's about 14 millimeters. So what I do is I simply add 10 millimeters to whatever measurement my stack is. And that's the length that I make my interior coil. Although I'm showing you today how to make the bead with 1 large bead in the center, you can also make it with 2. Remember, if you add that second bead in the middle, you're going to have to change the length of the stack and make your interior coil longer by adding 10 millimeters. Once you've determined how long to make your coil, you're going to go ahead and actually make it. So I'm starting out with about 3 feet, so a little more than half a wingspan of 26 gauge wire, and you want to make sure the wire is soft. And I normally, to start, grab both of the ends and just sort of slide my hand down to kind of put a little to basically center the bend that I'm going to start with. And I'm going to slide it on the mandrel. I'm using a mandrel with a handle that came from some crazy old coiler I have, but a regular straight mandrel works just fine. So whenever I coil, I always start the same way. I hold the non-coiling end in my non-dominant hand and begin up, over, and away from myself, coiling around the mandrel. It's easier if you work a little bit toward the end of the mandrel. And I'm just going to keep on coiling with one side for a little while. You want to make sure your coil is nice and snug and tight. You don't want a lot of gaps in it, or it's going to make the bead a little bit weak. I just flipped it over so I could coil with my other end because I'm trying to keep it centered. Basically with this bead we start in the middle and build our way to the outside, and then we add weaving that gives the bead some structure and some body. Here you see my completed coil, which is now 24 millimeters long. And now I want to show you the secret of making your bead antiqued. If you like to work with antiqued wire and you like that nice contrast and shine, you want to antique your wire beforehand. As you can see, when you make your initial coil, it ends up all the way on the inside of this bead. So the reason I'm telling you that if you want to use antiqued wire, you need to polish it after you make it is because otherwise there's no way you're going to be able to reach it. Once you've made the coil, you're going to go ahead and take a pro polish pad or steel wool or whatever you normally use to polish and polish this coil clean. The only time you're going to be able to reach this coil to polish it is right now before continuing on with the project. So it's important to keep it in mind from the beginning if that's how you like your beads done. You can certainly take the finished bead and put it in to antiquing solution and go ahead and do that, but your interior coil is going to end up completely blackened. This way your interior coil has some nice contrast and you can see the coiling down the center of the bead. Once I've formed my interior coil and have it at the proper length, I'm going to go ahead and start building the bead. I'm going to wrap this wire around no more than 3 times to bring it in a little bit from the end. Once I've wrapped down a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and string my beads onto the wire. I'm stringing a 4 millimeter, a daisy, a rondelle, another daisy, and a 4 millimeter, just as I did when I measured my stack when I started. Once I have my beads on, I'm going to pull my wire across to the other end of my coil. I usually like to stick my thumbnail in here, and I'm going to wrap a little ways from the end so it's about even with where we started on the first side. So you're going to repeat the exact same string sequence again, and then pull your wire back across to the side where you started and wrap your wire once around the end. I wrap it as close to the end of the coil as I can possibly get it, but I don't wrap it any further in toward where the beads are now strung. You can see that each row is sitting directly across from the other row, so it's creating sort of like an eyeball shape here with your upper lashes and your lower lashes. And that your beads move around kind of freely and you've got some exposed wire at the ends. That is correct. It looks wrong, but it's right. The one thing to do is to keep your tension at least tight enough so that your big beads kind of touch up against the mandrel and the coil at the middle. Once you've put on your first 2 rows, you're going to need to switch wires. So I always flip the mandrel over to get to the other wire end. I'm going to wrap this one in the exact same way as the last one over the top of the central coil until I've kind of got it in between 2 of the rows that I've already stitched on. So I'm now going to repeat the same stringing sequence for the 3rd time, and I often will take that first wire and loosely wrap it around the mandrel to anchor it while I do the second half of the bead. It gets a little jumbly and crazy to hang on to at this point because you've got all these loose beads wrapped on. So all I'm going to do is repeat the same thing, put on that string sequence and wrap around the end. And I'm going to wrap all the way over to the other side so that I can put my fourth row in between these two. I've strung on my fourth and last segment of beads. And you can see I'm kind of sticking my thumbnail down in there, making a little bend, and I'm pulling across and wrapping around. When you get to this last wrap, you're kind of wrapping over the top of a bunch of other wrapping, and at this point what you have is what I'd like to describe as a jumbly blob of beads. It's very disorderly, the beads scoot around, they don't want to sit in place. That's because the basket weave that we're going to do next is what really solidifies the structure of this bead and holds everything together. So I'm now going to begin basket weaving the caps on this bead, but I kind of have to decide where to start. So I usually turn my bead around, and what I'm looking for is a big gap between rows, which, ta-da, it's right there. You can see that these two rows sit kind of far apart. So that's where I'm going to start because I actually want to pull one row slightly closer to the other. I try to do my best to hold my beads kind of in the center when I begin, but no matter what you do, they're going to scoot around. So when I begin the basket weave, I'm actually going to cross over the wire that I want to capture, pass over it, bring the end back down underneath it, on the side where the beads are. You don't want to bring your end around on this side. You want to bring your end around toward the beads, not toward the end of your coil, toward the middle. After completely encircling the first wire, I'm going to move over to the second wire and repeat the step. So I pass over the wire, I go back underneath it, and then I pull the tension down tight and complete the wrap around. You won't be able to see the basket weave forming until you've done several rows of it. So the first part of it is more an act of anchoring everything into position and creating the structure that your basket is woven on. So again, I'm jumping to the next wire, going over the wire, ducking back underneath, and pulling the tension tight and completing that wrap. And then I'm going to jump to the last of the 4 wires, wrap around, pull snug, and now I'm all the way back to where I started on the first end. So now that you're getting in the groove here, we're going to keep on basket weaving. One of the things that I find helps shape the basket weave much nicer is, first of all, to kind of shove the beads up the wire toward the cap that you're weaving. And secondly, to pull your wire down flat and across and kind of bend it around the next crossover wire before wrapping around it and pulling that tight. That tends to make your wire go exactly in a nice, orderly fashion right where you've put it, right where you want it to be. So. So as you weave this cap, it's going to get wider and wider. But once you've done 2 or 3 passes all the way around the bead, you're going to want to switch to the other end. I start the second end in the same way as the first. I look for the big gap between rows, and that's where I start my weave. Remember, you cross over the top of that wire and then duck underneath. You don't want to duck underneath and then pull it back up to the top, or the basket weave comes out inside out, and it's not nearly as pretty. If you forget to switch ends as you're doing this weave, it's really easy to continue weaving, and you end up with a really big long cap on one side and a really stubby cap on the other side, which is fine. You can say that's a design element and say it was intended to be teardrop shaped. These are not intended to be neat and perfect, so driving yourself crazy in a quest to get them neat and perfect is just a waste of energy. Once your beads no longer wiggle around on here and you're getting pretty full on the crossover wires, you can pretty much call it done. If you continue to weave and try and get it too tight, you can actually break the crystals. So I'm going to do one last wrap on this wire, and I heard a little snapping noise, and that little snapping noise is my reminder that that's tight enough. So I'm going to complete that wrap all the way around. So now you can see why I love these angulated cutters. You can really get them in close after you've done that last full wrap and trim your wire off. If the little end is sticking up, you can try and get in there and tuck it down, but they don't really matter and they're not going to go anywhere. I've used a pair of knotting tweezers before to pinch them down, but really, honestly, they're not going anywhere. So I usually polish them just a little bit to finish. I had been polishing this one as I was putting it together, so it'd be more visible for you on the camera. But once it's all cleaned up, go ahead and remove the mandrel from the center. Now, in terms of the care, feeding, and use of your bead, you can go ahead and string about a 20 gauge wire back through the inside of this. Even though the 1mm mandrel we made it on is the same size as 18 gauge, these are never perfectly square down the middle, so sometimes it's hard to get 18 back through them. You also don't want to store them any place where they're going to get squished, because they can be mushed down. To be able to get this nice fine basket weave on here, you really do need to use a light gauge wire like 26 gauge. So the overall scale of this bead is pretty much the largest bead you want to put here in the middle is a 6mm bead. You need to resist the temptation to make them into enormous beads because they're structurally not up to the task. And it's hard to impossible to recreate this weave even using 24 gauge. Thank you for coming and making Beadily Dee beads with me. I hope you enjoyed yourself and that you'll continue making them because, as you can see, I can't stop. We'll see you next time. Thanks.